Morning, everybody. Thanks for joining Jen and me. And as Alex mentioned, you'll be recorded for all of your colleagues for this session. And just to alert you, like you always know that you're getting the PDF of this PowerPoint presentation, but I decided that what would be helpful to all of us is to talk about what we've accomplished in the last 3 weeks. This is the 4th week of talking about seeking safety. And the objectives for today are to specify strategies to help people identify knee-jerk automatic thoughts, urges, and the emotions connected with them. Practice explaining this in language you would use in your everyday practice. Of course, for a lot of you, this is CBT. This is talking about how to keep a thought record, how to look at distorted thinking, how to do cognitive countering. And the second objective is describe common beliefs related to substance abuse, addiction, trauma, and PTSD, as well as alternative healing means. So this is, again, looking at people's beliefs and cognitions related to substance abuse, addiction, trauma, PTSD, and looking in a narrative kind of way at a different kind of story of healing meanings within those experiences. And then finally, describe and learn strategies to coach people to develop and strengthen compassionate self-talk and change talk. So looking at compassion for self and for others, and looking at solution and change talk to, again, pave the way for recovery. So nothing to disclose as usual. So the first bunch of slides are slides that I've added to every presentation for Seeking Safety as a review for all of you. And so what I'm going to do this morning is a little bit different than the last 3 weeks. I'm going to review the objectives and the major points of each of the preceding weeks. So what we did, you can see I'm racing through a lot of the review, is talk about seeking safety as far as how trauma exposure can lead to substance abuse problems, including how substance use can impact trauma healing. So that was the interaction between trauma and severe reactions to severe stressors, and how substance abuse initially might evolve from self-medication, and how substance abuse alone puts people at risk for being traumatized and abused and manipulated and controlled, which furthers stress and post-traumatic stress disorder. We talked about the advantages of having an evidence-based treatment, which can treat co-occurring trauma and PTSD with substance misuse, abuse, dependence, and addiction. And we also talked about how Seeking Safety has expanded to be dealing with any kind of severe and prominent mental challenges other than trauma and co-occurring substance abuse and misuse. Then we talked about the overall structure, timing, and flexibility of Seeking Safety. Again, how it's administered in a collaborative, co-creative, person-centered, person is the expert on themselves, strength-based, solution-focused, transparent, shared decision-making kind of process, and that all those components are necessary for Seeking Safety to be helpful. That's the same kind of way in which we relate to helping people with safety planning for any kind of risky behavior. So they're very much aligned in the way that they're administered, and that Seeking Safety is very flexible in the sense that it can be a crisis intervention. It can be a significant part of safety planning for people at acute risk of self-harm, if not suicidality. It can be administered in an individual manner, in a group manner, in open-ended groups, in closed groups, and you can repeat the same topic and module time after time, or you can shift from one to the other. You can have people who are involved with the same provider, both individually and in group. Very flexible, very adaptable. We talked about the format, which I have here on this slide, the check-in, the quotation, or the ritual that helps set the stage for what the group with you or the individual with you have decided is the theme or the topic to explore. Then you explore the topic, relate it to everybody's experience in the group or that particular individual. They chose this area to focus on, setting boundaries, looking at what are dangerous situations, exploring what a healthy relationship means to them, looking at recovery thinking, whatever they might look at. And then you discuss that at length, look to see how people adapt it to their own beliefs, needs, what calls to them, what speaks to them, what furthers their sense of recovery as to further their sense of risk and lack of safety. You practice it, you brainstorm about alternatives, modify it for that individual, then approach what are barriers and obstacles that might get in the way. Problem solve that. And keep on expanding in it until you arrive at some kind of task or action step that they can commit to, feeling that it's doable, it's practical, it doesn't call on any other resources other than their own, and something that they are willing to try out. You almost always invoke grounding and centering techniques and safe coping skills to further embellish this topic and this practice. Then you have the commitment sheet that they make a commitment to themselves and to you and to the rest of the group. And you make a commitment to the group and to the individuals about what you'll follow through. And then the checkout, where just like in safety planning, you end up a safety planning session by saying, what do you take away from our talk today or our meeting today that most resonates with you as far as reasons for living, reasons for moving on, reasons to be more hopeful and optimistic about the future. And for seeking safety is, what is the one thing that you took out from today's meeting that helps you on the path towards being more safe and secure and more oriented towards recovery as opposed to harm? So in the first week, I'm flashing forward to where we're going to be today. So this is what we're going to cover today: recovery thinking, creating meaning, and compassion. So the first week, we went through all the rationale for seeking safety, its flexibility, the timing, the format, etc. In the second week, what we did was look at, again, this overview and look at, if you had limited time, what were the modules that you would most want to use? Safety is the very first and the primary one, which is, what does safety mean to that particular person or group? And of this whole vast array of 80 plus safe coping skills, what do they want to practice? What speaks to them? What's not on the list that they would like to add in their collective experience and wisdom to everybody in the group and everybody who follows? As I suggested, that you keep a poster of this and a roster of everybody's ideas so that everybody is contributing to the sense of safety for the seeking safety community. And then you would look at other modules of the psychoeducation piece of PTSD, taking back your power. What does stress look like in the person? How does it manifest itself in their body, in their soul, in their spirit, in their psychology, in their emotions, in their actions? How does it manifest itself in their relationships? And a similar module for substance use, when substances control you. How do they put you in vulnerable positions? By impairing your judgment, your impulse control, by setting the stage for you to seek out endangering relationships as opposed to healthy and safe relationships in order to continue to have access to the drug and to use the drug with people who support the drug use as opposed to people who support you coping with things other than with drugs and drug use. And then detaching from emotional pain is the module, the topic area that talks about grounding and centering. And within that, we talked about the 3 different types of grounding and centering techniques: mental grounding and centering, physical grounding and centering. Feel your feet on the floor. Feel the chair beneath you. Look around at the physical environment. What's the color of the walls? Are there windows? What do you see out of the windows? Grounding into reality. So mental, physical, and then soothing. And we talked about one example where you could do even with young children, which is tell me your favorite color, your favorite song, your favorite animal, your favorite movie, whatever it might be. So it pulls out, just like the coping skills, the on my own coping skills in safety planning, all the things that people can do to enhance their coping and their safety that require no one else and no kinds of resources other than themselves, and that they can practice time and time again throughout the course of the week and the day without any effort. It's very easy for them to do it, and we're hoping that that habit becomes as ingrained as the habit of using substances or other kinds of risky behavior. That was week 2, which we ended with an introduction to asking for help. Last week, what we talked about is making commitments, coping with triggers, and as we mentioned, not wanting to use the word triggers, but more activating or precipitating factors, or the kinds of situations that when they occur, bring up feelings of danger, vulnerability, re-experiencing previous trauma. In extreme situations, full-blown dissociation, depersonalizing, derealizing, so you lose touch of this very painful situation as a difficult and problematic, but sometimes necessary way to cope with overwhelming trauma and stress. Coping with triggers, and then looking at red and green flags, which is strategies to help people identify dangerous situations and relationships, how to avoid avoidable suffering, and relationships and situations in which they spiral up, green flags, as opposed to the red flags. Connected to that is how to set appropriate boundaries in relationships. Not to give up on or be too distant from or avoid healthy relationships, being open to them, but again, setting reasonable boundaries, especially when you ask for help, knowing who to ask for help from. Is that person safe? And you're making an ask that's easy for you to ask for and easy for them to grant your ask with what you're asking them to do. And then setting boundaries on dangerous relationships, making sure that you don't get sucked in to being overly vulnerable with people who may misuse that information to your detriment. Being overly vulnerable to other people's ways of controlling you, manipulating you, being overly vulnerable to their support for harm and risky behavior, and their dismay if you try to preserve your sense of safety and well-being and health and self-compassion. So red and green flags are intertwined with setting boundaries. recognizing danger and extricating yourself from that, recognizing security and trust and safety and health and moving towards that. Gradually, carefully, safely, but moving towards that. And then we talked about other strategies related to asking for help, like I mentioned earlier. Who is going to be someone that you can trust, who has your best interest at heart, versus people that you either don't know what their motivations are or their interests are, or people who are overtly dangerous to you, risky to you, support your worst impulses and urges and cravings, as opposed to supporting your judgment, your self-compassion, your sense of security and safety, and your wisdom in that area. And then for those people who you can trust, asking something that doesn't ask too much, so you don't set yourself up to be rejected and abandoned and overwhelm them with your vulnerability and your needs. So we talked about asking for a ride to a group session is a much smaller ask and an easier one for someone to say yes or no to than if you call somebody in the middle of the night with an emergency, or somebody in one of the groups using an example of saying, my childcare failed today. Can you drop your job and drop everything and take care of my kid for the next 8 hours? Even the best person might just have to say no because it's too much. Without any warning, it's too much. And then you'll feel upset with them. They'll feel upset with you for being overly injudicious about asking and making them feel bad for disappointing you. So asking for help is a real skill. And relating to that is making a commitment to getting other people to support your recovery. Again, choosing those people wisely, not asking too much. What do healthy relationships actually look like? A lot of people don't know, don't have the lived experience of healthy relationships. Every relationship to them is unhealthy. People demean them, discount them, control them, discourage them, abuse them, neglect them, traumatize them. Answer only to their risks for excitement seeking and self-harm, not to their wisdom, their need for security, how to better establish trust. So it's very important for people to talk about what do healthy relationships look like. Just like in asking for help, what is a wise way to ask for help and what is a problematic way? And then always looking at community resources. It's not just your relatively small area of comfort and trust and support in healthy relationships, but the wider community. So self-help groups, support groups, food banks, shelters, agencies that help you secure supported and secure housing, people who deal with food insecurity, people who help with childcare, battered shelters, all the kinds of ways in which the community is out there to support. Text lines, hotlines, warm lines, drop-in centers, crisis centers. We want to give people the sense that there are many, many ways to get help from others in areas, in agencies, in places, and with people that support their recovery, that engender trust. So that's what we did in the previous 3 weeks, and we're going to conclude our discussion, which is still a very brief review of all the richness of seeking safety, with talking about these cognitive behavioral issues of recovery thinking, creating meaning, and then in a narrative way, as well as the cognitive behavioral way, restorying, creating a new story of recovery, or embellishing the story of recovery that you already have. to make that the dominant story of your life. And then compassion. What does compassion actually mean? How is it expressed towards yourself? So the premise of seeking safety, to sum it all up, is that the best way to heal from overwhelming trauma, substance abuse, and severe illness, physical or mental, is to establish a sense of compassion for yourself and safety and security in yourself and in your relationships with others and the larger world. Without having that secure base of attachment, that sense of what self-compassion actually means, what it means to acknowledge your own difficulties and forgive yourself, and to move on, to be compassionate for others. We're all flawed individuals, we all make messes. Understanding that, learning what repair is, both within yourself and with other people. That's how we instill hope. That's how we further strengthen the foundation for ongoing recovery. Any questions about the review before I move on? Feel free to unmute yourself or type them in the chat. If I don't see anything, I'll just plug right on ahead. Okay, great. So the first piece that connects very much to CBT as far as automatic thoughts, beliefs, how thoughts lead to feelings and behaviors, the different kinds of distorted thinking, how to challenge distorted thinking with evidence to the contrary, how that challenging, the countering of distorted thinking can lead to not only different ways of looking at things and framing things and thinking about things, but also how to feel differently about what's happened, how to be solution and strength focused, and how to be more hopeful about alternative ways of acting. So in recovery thinking, it's how to talk to yourself with respect and support. And you can see how, like as before, a lot of these topic areas are all of a piece. So you can't have recovery thinking without self-compassion. They relate together. So here's some examples of substance abuse thoughts versus recovery thoughts. I need it now versus I can wait. I'm really stressed out. I need that pill. I need that drug. I need that shot. Versus I can wait. I know how to soothe myself, distract myself, ground and center myself. I don't have to get into that urge right away. I need drugs to numb the pain versus I can tolerate feeling down just a little bit. I know how to cope safely with that other than with drugs. I'll never get over this, being totally hopeless about the future. Like we talked about, one of the important things of seeking safety is it's present tense oriented. It doesn't dwell on the past. It doesn't have what's called psychic determinism as a philosophy. Psychic determinism is this idea that early life events so constrain us in our future that our path forward is extremely narrow. We'll always be suffering from everything that we suffered from in the distant past. Seeking safety looks at moment to moment in the very present. What can I do differently to further myself along the path of recovery and healing? So I'll never get over this versus take it a step at a time. One small step leads to another. Change happens all the time. Change for the better happens. I have the agency to make the right choices for myself. It's not that everything is out of my control. Some things are. But again, I can avoid avoidable suffering, and I can look at potential rather than pathology. Similarly with PTSD, I want to cut my arm versus I've got to solve this problem. There's no point. versus life is what I make of it, how I frame it, what I focus on. One of the things I found really helpful for people with trauma is to look at selective abstraction, that distorted way of thinking in CBT language of pulling out all the positive or neutral stuff and focusing solely on the negative. So if Alex and I were having a conversation, and one time out of a 2-hour conversation, he said something like, Abhi, you were a little bit late turning in your PowerPoint. It made life a little difficult for me. And the rest of the time, it was all easy and fun. And we were talking about how much we enjoyed working together. If I only focused on that one comment, that's an example of PTSD thinking in this language versus recovery thinking, where I just pulled out that one slight little comment and made it the whole of our interaction. So there's no point versus life is what I make of it. I make of it what I pay attention to. I make of it by selectively attending to times when I'm less symptomatic, when I make the right choice, when I do harm reduction, as opposed to harm seduction, and involve myself fully in my urges and cravings. Bad relationships are all I can get versus I can find good people. And we know a lot of people who will talk about one terrible relationship after the next, where they're abused, battered, controlled, neglected, versus there is no such thing as a healthy relationship. Well, how do you meet people? You meet people because you meet them in bars and you're an excitement seeker. So people who seem charismatic and very emotional and very expressive attract you, and you minimize and discount how violent they are, how volatile they are, how they seem to be angry. And early in the relationship, you're infatuated with the danger and the excitement that they provide. But quickly you learn that the danger is a big cost to you. And you get out of that relationship, hopefully, but then you find yourself attracted to another dangerous, exciting person. So moving from bad relationships are all I can ever get to I can find good people. They are out there. That's another example. So rethinking tools. And again, this is basically steeped in Aaron Beck's cognitive behavioral therapy and modules within that, like problem solving treatment and behavioral activation, pleasurable activity scheduling, maintaining a thought record. All those cognitive therapy techniques are embedded in this particular module. List your options. In any situation, you have choices. You have agency. Again, there's always something to do other than risky behavior. And as Najavit said, and I quoted that in the very first time that we met, no trauma, no awful situation, no matter how catastrophic and difficult, must inevitably lead to substance abuse, dependence, and addiction. You have choices. Notice the source. Who's telling you something? Can they be believed? So if somebody said, well, to you that you're only attracted to people when you're totally disinhibited, you're funny, you're creative, you're exciting when you're on cocaine. And when you're not, nobody wants to have anything to do with you. Well, who's telling you that versus other people who don't comment on them at all or say, I'm a little worried for you when you're high. You look like you're out of control. So who's telling you something? Look at the source. Again, are they somebody who endangers you, who encourages your risky behavior, or somebody who encourages you to reduce your harm, to seek safety. Create a mental picture that helps you feel better. That's again a safe coping skill. Praise yourself. Notice what you did right. That word is very important. Notice. That's what I mean by selectively attending. We want people to be solution focused, recovery focused, change focused. So like I talked about a number of times from solution focused therapy, which Najavitz doesn't quote at all in her work, but I found it a perfect match, just like motivational interviewing is for seeking safety. Look at when the problem is less. So for instance, using that example of people who party with cocaine, when was it that you got all that traditional expected kind of pressure to be at the party and to use, and somehow you stepped out of the room and sought somebody who wasn't using? What was different about that time? What was different in you? What was different in the people who were using? Maybe they were so out of control that they put you off. Maybe there was somebody that you had met earlier who wasn't there using, who you wanted to get to know more. But what did you learn from that experience that you can practice the next time? So instead of viewing people, again, as having nothing to offer themselves, that we look at people as deficits, lacks, dysfunction, disorder, diagnoses. We're looking at people that they all have abilities, competencies, talents, skills, wisdom, experience, judgment. And we look at all the places where they put forward all of those wonderful things that they have, as opposed to focus solely on the times when they don't. Learn from experience, praise yourself, notice what you did right, and then create a new story. Tell what happened in a way that is respectful of yourself. So if you're in a relationship, a domestic violence relationship, where you're totally dependent for basic needs, for food, for shelter, for money, for any kind of support, in quotes, for your basic needs, from a batterer who controls you with that support, won't allow you to connect to anybody else, is hypervigilant. Other people are to be avoided at all costs, and if you violate any of that, you're physically battered, emotionally battered, in a very dangerous kind of way. Tell the story to yourself of how that person is controlling you, how in a lot of ways you couldn't help but succumb because of the power that they had, and what were windows of opportunity for escaping them. And there's a lot in the trauma literature about traumatic growth, moving from victim to survivor to thriver. Going back to that thing of find a meaningful lesson that can help you the next time. Think of the consequences, pros and cons, over the long term, over the short term. In motivational interviewing, we talk about decisional balance, right? So this idea of what's looking towards recovery, what's looking towards relapse, what's within your power to do. And we've talked about earlier how sometimes the initial solution becomes the problem itself. So the example I usually cite, because it's an easy one that resonates with a lot of people, is if you feel social anxiety and feel that it's difficult to relate to other people, especially in a huge gathering, as yourself, totally sober. So you drink, everybody else is drinking, why not you? They encourage you to drink. And that helps in that way of you feel less inhibited, you feel more social, you're less anxious. It's a sedative, hypnotic, and anxiolytic. alcohol is. It's a downer. But then you find out that you're developing tolerance, that you experience withdrawal, and that your social set basically encourages your use. So the initial solution, which did work, alcohol, becomes the problem itself. Thinking of the consequences would be really important. So for instance, we providers who can prescribe, often use benzodiazepines in ways in which they're contradicted. As you know, the way it's listed by the FDA and the PDR and all evidence-based practices, benzodiazepines are really helpful in short-term limited treatment. In long-term, they have a lot of side effects, including dependence, tolerance, and withdrawal. So we need to look at the pros and cons. If we use it in a limited fashion in the short term, then the benefits may outweigh the problems. But if we think about using it and relying on it day after day, year after year, then the cons might outweigh the pros. Strive to look at the facts objectively. So in that example I gave with Alex, instead of just dwelling on, ruminating on, feeling miserable about that one comment, which could have been totally neutral. It's just like, usually, Abby, you meet the deadline way in advance. This time it was a little bit too short. I was a little bit worried about making sure I had the PowerPoint prepared for your presentation. I was going to say it in the most soft way, but if I was looking for him to criticize me, I would latch onto that. So I think of all the different ways in which I can interpret it. He was being helpful. Most of the content, most of our interactions were either neutral or very positive. Why am I making the choice to focus solely on the negative and magnifying it out of proportion? Try to look at the facts objectively. Brainstorm. This is problem solving. Try to think of as many interpretations of a negative situation as possible. And one thing I find is that it's really helpful to say, what they say their roommate or their best friend or their partner or spouse or their child, whoever it might be, if they've talked about, say, well, if they were in the room, what would they see? What would they report? What's the real impact on my life? So that little side comment that Alec makes, it doesn't have to devastate me. It doesn't have to affect anything except I'll try to do better the next time and turn it in on time, right? Make a decision. If you're stuck, try just picking an imperfect road as long as it's safe, meaning that you make use of what you have. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Remember that one small change, one small step leads to another and another. Remember a better time. Get perspective by noticing good times. Discover rules to live by. Identify principles that keep you focused on recovery. For example, take good care of my body or myself. When in doubt, do what's hardest. So what that means is, like especially in PTSD, it may be very tempting to totally avoid a situation, but you can't. If you don't deal with it on some level, then anybody who remotely resembles your perpetrator from a far distance, or from the perfume or cologne that they're wearing, or their hair color, or their stature, whatever it is, they'll fill you with all that re-experiencing anxiety and panic that you've had before. So recovery thinking about rethinking, right? How to view it. Everyone is thinking all the time, even when you're not aware of it. Notice how thinking impacts your life. Rethinking does not mean positive thinking, it means realistic thinking. And the reality is, every one of us does things that we regret. Every one of us always does things that helps us. Your thoughts are not wrong or bad. they're just your thoughts. One example of this is very much acceptance and commitment therapy. That's what acceptance means in ACT, is that don't put a valence on your thoughts. They're neither good nor bad. Rethinking takes active practice. It's a profound emotional experience. Some keys to make rethinking a deep experiences are identify hot emotional thoughts. Stay specific. If you have a general thought, such as my life is hopeless, try to break it down into what specific and recent real life experiences that affect that. So for those of you who really like CBT, these modules actually break it down into everyday language. And I think a lot of you would enjoy using this kind of way of speaking as opposed to the traditional kind of lecture that we give people about distorted thinking and its subtypes and how to use a thought record. Now we're moving to creative meaning. Changing your thinking can change your life. That's the whole premise of narrative therapy as well as cognitive behavioral therapy. If you have a story that's a dominant cultural story where you're hopelessly confined and condemned and stigmatized and discounted and harmed by the labels of racism, classism, ageism, that you have your personhood and your identity subsumed by a label, as opposed to all that you are. Changing your thinking, changing your story, you can build the elements of a new story, of a healthy self, of a self-compassionate self, of someone who has a lot to give, not only to themselves, but to others. So here's some examples. And again, this is Najavitz relabeling cognitive distortions in a way that might be more common sense and everyday language for people. Deprivation reasoning. I've suffered a lot, so I need substances or other self-destructive behavior. I'm entitled to it. Actions speak louder than words. You show your distress by actions. Otherwise, people won't see your pain. Your sense of time is distorted. You believe a negative feeling will last forever. I am my trauma, like I just said, that you're subsumed, your whole identity is overcome by trauma. It's more important than anything else about you. That's the way you introduce yourself. That's the way you see yourself. Everything is filtered that you're a victim of trauma. Confusing needs and wants. This is really important. You want something very badly, urges, cravings, impulses. So that means you have to have it. Not true. You can have an urge or a craving for something that is not good for you. And maybe you need something else. The uniqueness fallacy is you alone have a particular problem. No one else could possibly understand what you're going through. That's very much linked to I am my trauma. No one has suffered more than you. No one has had more horrific abuse than I have. And sometimes, I think all of us know that in, quote, support groups, we find people competing with each other as to who's the sickest, who's the most pathologized. That the only attention and connection that they have is through this label of being less than. Not looking at potential again, looking solely in pathology. So seeking safety, Najavitz looks at meanings that harm versus that meanings that help. I've had a hard time, so I'm entitled to get high versus a happy, functional life will make up for my suffering far more than hurting myself. The scratches on my arm will show what I feel versus instead of acting, put your feelings into words. Language is the most powerful way for people to get to know you. I'm a victim of abuse, my life is pain, versus I'm more than what I suffered. I have many different aspects of my life, many different roles, interests, goals, hopes, ambitions, talents, competencies, skills, insights, wisdom, experience. I am not governed totally by my views. My life is not endless suffering. I need to relax with caring versus I may want it, but I don't need it. Remember that distinction between wants and needs. Needs are essential. Food, shelter, clothing. Recovery is an essential need. Unless you've lived through what I had, you can't help me. Versus give people a chance. People don't have to experience exactly what you've experienced for them to understand you. And again, if the model of relationships is you're the expert on your life, and it's their job to attend fully, to listen carefully, to take in all that you are, to try to speak your language as opposed to theirs. That's our efforts as a provider. That's what healthy relationships are. We move out of our own meanings and comfort zones to try to embrace the fullness of other people. Now, what compassion is. People with PTSD and substance abuse typically beat themselves up and blame themselves. That's why compassion is so important. And we talked about in safety planning, mental misery and mental suffering and self-hate are some of the highest risk factors for people who are suicidal. Remember that triad of hopeless, helpless, worthless, feeling worth less as opposed to worthy. People are quick to recognize this harsh self-talk, but may say that they do so because it's true, or they're seeing as taking responsibility. The issue with harsh self-talk is especially if it's extreme and, using CBT terms, dichotomous, all or nothing, right? The only way to view yourself is to blame yourself, further victimize yourself, see yourself as filled with pathology, not potential. Those are all ways in which you deny yourself compassion. The goal is to replace destructive self-talk with compassionate, caring, and understanding self-talk. Harshness leads almost never to positive change, and certainly does not lead to lasting change. Compassion, to put this in bold, helps one understand their own motivations and emotions in order to avoid unsafe behavior in the future. For those of you who are interested, by the way, there is such a thing as compassion therapy, of how to teach people how to be compassionate towards themselves and towards other people. Again, it's one of the therapies that I'm trained in and a trainer in. So there's all sorts of ways to expand upon this sense of compassion and what that means. So it becomes as much of an impulse for someone as self-harm, if not more. What compassion is not an excuse for continuing to engage in unsafe behavior. Being a compassionate provider means helping the consumer understand and protect themselves. Viewed from a parenting perspective, that many decades ago, we had the distinction between authoritative, indulgent, authoritarian, and neglectful parenting. So authoritative means that you set expectations and boundaries that are reasonable, but still maintain a loving, caring, secure, attaching relationship. Indulgent means that the only way that you have a relationship is to be devoid of any kind of expectations or boundaries or goals. The sky's the limit, so you continue to encourage people to do whatever they want, which can be looking at enhancing their unsafe, risky behavior. Authoritarian is the opposite. You don't care about a relationship or you don't evidence care about your relationship, all you do is punish and control and set boundaries. So in this case, what they're talking about is overlooking unsafe behavior, being overly indulgent, overly permissive, can leave the consumer feeling invalidated and ignored. Cheerleading or saying just nice things, teaching compassion through warm fuzzies is likely to convey a lack of compassion. It's not person-centric, it's not specific, and it's so overly simplified that it's not believable. So this is, most therapies, by the way, have what they call complements. So what I say to people when I'm training people is that compliments always must be truthful and to the point. So if you have somebody like in a family session, I'm trained in lots of different modalities of family therapy, and a lot of people who are first learning this kind of thing will try to reframe somebody who's angry and violent as being expressive or exuberant. Well, that's not true. That's not true. The therapist doesn't believe it. The family doesn't believe it. And so to be compassionate, you can say is something very different. So we have to be careful. But compassion doesn't mean that we accept everything and support everything. That's not helpful to people. So here's one example of compassion self-talk versus harsh self-talk. I drank last night, what a loser. I can't do anything right. Cognitive countering again. I know drinking is dangerous, but I did it anyway. There must be a reason. Maybe it's because I'm upset about my brother's death. That was horrific. I'm grieving. Next time I feel an urge to drink, I'll try to prevent it by calling my sponsor to talk about how I feel. So going back to that, remember all those things about there's lessons to be learned. There's always alternatives. And going back to what we've talked about many times before, in that stages of change theory by DiClemente and Prochaska that a lot of us are steeped in, pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation, action, and maintenance. We know that maintaining change for the good, is steps back and steps forward. That's like life is. So this is compassion is saying, I drank last night, but it's not the end of my harm reduction. It's not the end of my progress. I want to look for a reason. I'm forgiving myself for the fact that I was overwhelmed by my brother's death. That was an unusual situation. Maybe that's why I drank. Next time I feel an urge to drink, I'll try to prevent it by calling my sponsor right away. If I love myself, what would I say to myself right now? If I were really listening to my deepest needs, what would I say to myself? How would I speak to my best friend if they were in the same situation? What would I say to myself if I were a young child and a good parent? So this finishes our 4-week review of seeking safety. Again, we want to end with a life worth living. And Alex has typed in the link so that you can get credit. And I'll be leaving a little bit early because I have a 10 o'clock session with another group. So I very much hope, and I know that Jen joins me in this, that you join us for next week, which we're really excited about. We're going to review safety planning and seeking safety and show all the ways in which seeking safety offers a wealth of resources for safety planning, and that the safety planning framework is fully embedded in the administration and the implementation of seeking safety therapy. Hope to join you all next week. Be well.